Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Sunday Show. I'm Martin Geissler. Here's what's coming up this morning. More than 600 jobs are to go at Dundee University, and there are to be massive cuts to teaching there as well. Without this drastic action, the institution would have closed, we're told. And it's not the only Scottish university in crisis. Have these places become too reliant on foreign students and their money? Can we still afford to keep tuition free for all Scots? To answer that, we will have Alison Payne from the Thinktank Reform Scotland in the studio. And the Education Secretary, Gilruth, will tell me whether free tuition is still a rock-solid policy for her government. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, was in Scotland this week saying a hike in defence spending will boost Scottish jobs. But who's going to pay for it? People on welfare will have to take a hit, apparently. That sparked a revolt among Labour MPs, and this morning there is talk of a U-turn. The Scotland Office Minister, Kirsty Mcneill, will join me. Hopefully she can tell us what's going on. And after all that, it is over to Graham Stewart on the radio and on BBC Sounds. Hi, Graham.
Morning, Martin. We'll assess the prospects for peace in Ukraine after the Prime Minister hosted a virtual summit of world leaders. A government minister has admitted using AI to come up with policy advice, so we'll discover how artificial intelligence could help us in our work. And we're talking country music with the legendary broadcaster Bob Harris, as a major festival takes place this weekend in Glasgow, Belfast and London, plus a full review of the Sunday papers.
Excellent. Thanks, Graham. Whispering Bob on a Sunday morning. What could be better? Let's get on with the show. Yeah, welfare, benefits, the education of our kids, all up for discussion this morning. Some pretty emotive subjects. If you want to join the conversation, the hashtag on social media, as ever, is BBC Sunday Show. Now, the scale of the cuts announced at Dundee University was pretty shocking. Unfortunately, though, it's not the only Scottish uni in trouble. Edinburgh University's £140 million deficit dwarfs Dundee's £35 million shortfall. And at First Minister's questions on Thursday, the Conservative MSP Jamie Green pointed out that 8 of Scotland's 18 unis are now running a deficit. The Scottish Government's just announced a further £10 million to help sustain the sector. But given how huge those deficits are, is that anywhere near enough? And if not, will some go to the wall? Well, I'm going to be speaking to Scotland's Education Secretary, Gilruth, shortly. But first, here with me now in the studio is Alison Payne, Research Director at the Thinktank Reform Scotland. Hi, Alison.
Good morning.
Let's just start with the basics for people who haven't been completely on top of this story all week. What's gone wrong at Dundee?
Well, I think there's been a whole kettle of different issues that they've been facing, but in 2019 Audit Scotland said that half of our universities were facing growing deficits. Those were attributed to issues such as pension payments, estate management, Brexit, and since then we've obviously had energy costs, national insurance rises and the global economic situation all playing a part that are going to impact those growing debts. But at the same time, nothing has changed from the sort of financial situation and how we're funding students.
How we're funding Scottish students?
Yes, indeed.
So is that part of the problem, the funding package for Scottish students?
Absolutely. It's unfair and unsustainable. And I think it's important to look across the piece at tertiary education, because we've very much focused on the university sector, but our college sector has seen a 17% real terms cut in recent years. And colleges are important for economic growth, but also for helping students get from certain areas into university themselves.
Right. I mean, this news, when it broke on, I think, Tuesday this week at Dundee, these cuts seemed like a kind of bolt from the blue. But from what you're saying, this has been coming down the tracks for years and years. Absolutely.
This should be an urgent wake-up call that action has to be happening. Now, at our think tank, we've talked about the potential of introducing a graduate payment. But that is something that, you could do where people pay a contribution after they've graduated and after they start earning over the Scottish average salary. But you can only do that if you start acting now, because obviously that would take 4 years for that revenue to accrue. There's a real danger if we continue to do nothing. As you say, a university might go to the wall. The reputation, international reputation of our institutions is being damaged by what's going on. What's going to happen we could end up facing a situation where the only option is upfront fees. So what we're saying is act now to avoid those.
So graduate payment, I mean, are you saying people should pay for their own tuition and pay it back like, you know, like English students do? Is that what that is?
We're talking about a graduate payment would be a way to maintain tuition free at the point of use. So you wouldn't accrue any upfront costs at all, but once you graduate, you would start, you would pay back perhaps something around about £5,500. So that's based on what Sir Andrew Cuby suggested 25 years ago about a graduate payment, and back then it was he suggested £3,000. So uprated today, we have suggested about £5,500 as a starting point. But what's really needed is for all the parties to get together to show some political leadership and look at the long-term funding sustainability of our higher education institutes.
It doesn't sound like there is much long-term funding sustainability at the moment. How realistic do you think it is that one of our great old institutions of learning, world-famous institutions of learning, will go to the wall?
I think there's a very real danger. Audit Scotland warned 6 years ago. I mean, we've got to start listening to what these warnings. We have to start acting now to stop this from happening. These are hugely important international organisations, and the reputation of Scotland is on the line here, but also for our students. If we want students to continue to go to university and go to such brilliant institutions, we need to help protect those, and that means changing the funding system.
Can we afford free universal tuition fees?
I think we can maintain free tuition fees free at the point of use if we consider other ways of funding it. So it's a graduate payment, but that's providing a better balance, we think, between the individual graduate and the wider society through the taxpayer, because there should be a balance. Society benefits from having a well-educated workforce, but so does the individual.
And you, as a think tank, think it's right and reasonable that the richest kids should get their education paid for as well, do you?
I think that it shouldn't be, your access to university shouldn't be based on your parents' income. It should be a thing of what is right for you, and looking at encouraging a wider cross-section of people to go to university. But what you can then do is that there's ways of using a graduate payment to encourage people to stay and work in certain sectors in Scotland or in certain locations where we're having demographic issues, and you know, offering to sort of cut or reduce those payments if they kind of contribute to that sort of longer-term economic growth of the country.
All right, really, really interesting stuff. Alison Payne from Reform Scotland, thank you very much indeed for helping us understand what is quite a complex issue, clearly, with a bit more clarity. Good stuff. Cheers, Stephen. Well, I'm pleased to say the Education Secretary, Gilruth, has joined me in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Martin.
What do you make of the assessment you've just heard? The words that struck out to me, unfair and unsustainable, the system at the moment.
Well, look, I think I first of all want to put on record my concern as Education Secretary regarding what's happening at Dundee University. It's deeply concerning and troubling time for staff and students alike. I was in Dundee on Friday, meeting with staff, meeting with the management team too. So the government is working with the Scottish Funding Council just now. We've already announced funding that you talked to earlier on Friday of an extra £10 million. That supplements the £15 million that was put in place through the Scottish budget process. And it's important that support goes to institutions. You've talked to some of the challenges there, and I accept that are struggling at the current time. We do need to be mindful, though, that the issues in relation to Dundee University are quite unique. Those relate to alleged financial mismanagement and are not in any way related to issues regarding tuition fees, which I appreciate you've been discussing this morning.
We don't have Dundee Uni on to answer those suggestions, but look, what I will say to you is that we know that I think the running costs of Edinburgh University at the moment, just kind of keeping the lights on, keep the labs running, are something like £120 million a month. I mean, they would run through that £10 million cheque you're writing in 2.5 days.
Absolutely. Our universities are facing an inordinate amount of challenge, but that's not a unique situation to Scotland, Martin. I mean, if you look across the United Kingdom, Cardiff, Durham, Newcastle, all considering substantial cuts to their workforce as a result of inflationary pressures. You've heard about some of the challenge in that respect this morning. Also the implication of national insurance contributions. So we know that University Scotland have forecast that that's going to cost universities in Scotland up to £45 million. So there is action that's been taken by the Scottish Government, but I do have to reflect that there's action being taken elsewhere that's making that job all the more difficult.
Right, they're a bit more fleet of foot, though, those universities you mentioned, because they're not kind of handcuffed into the system that we have here. You, as a government, make a contribution, or we as taxpayers make a contribution to the education of young Scots who go to university here, but it doesn't pay for all of their tuition. So what's happening here is that the universities have to bring in foreign students who are paying a lot to supplement that. Unless that changes, because that money, I think I'm right in saying, am I not, the money that you pay hasn't gone up in 15 years. So it's now, it's shrunk by 22%, by almost a quarter in that time. So it's a really bad business model, isn't it? If they've got to look abroad for the money to teach Scots.
I think as a point of principle, though, Martin, it's really important to say that my party, the SNP, is never going to support a policy whereby we bring back tuition fees. You know, we had the graduate endowment under the previous Labour Liberal executive. That's not an argument for bringing back tuition fees, Martin. We need to look at the progress we've made in relation to widening access for children from our poorest communities, now seeing access to university as for them. That's a good thing. And we've seen real and significant progress in that. The other point I would say is that there's other funding that we provide to the university sector. So in the budget for next year, we have increased university funding by 3.5%. We've increased research funding and asked from the sector. So it's not the case that that funding sits on its own in a silo. But universities are responding
But it's not enough. They've got these massive deficits and we're really in danger of seeing big universities going to the wall.
I recognise the challenge here, Martin. I think we need to be very careful, though. Some of the challenge that exists is not in the gift of the Scottish Government. So let's look at the challenges in relation to Brexit. Let's look at the challenges in relation to inflationary pressures. I've heard commentary from the Chancellor in that regard. And of course, the Chancellor, when Labour first came into office, said that budgets had not been inflation-proofed. So we need to be mindful that the Government has responded to that ask from the sector. We've provided them with additionality. We've also, through the budget, provided them with £50 million. We have put in an extra £10 million. And in the case of Dundee and the ongoing ask of the sector in relation to sustainability, we've been very open that we will listen to and engage with them through the auspices of the SFC. We also need to be mindful, though, Martin, our universities are independent, autonomous institutions. They are independent of government, and that is quite deliberately set out in legislation. So the Scottish Funding Council has a role here. We're playing an active role in providing that support.
But they're not completely independent, are they? Because they're completely locked into this system, where if they want to take on Scottish students, they've got to find the money to help pay for those Scottish students' tuition. Because you're not paying for it all, but you've guaranteed that this system will continue in perpetuity.
This approach is used by universities all over the United Kingdom. Scotland is not unique in that regard. You want to isolate the issue of tuition fees, and I simply say that policy decision from the SNP is not going to change. We are not going to bring back tuition fees under an SNP government. That's a point of principle.
If a kid goes to Fettes in Edinburgh, that child's parents are paying £33,000 a year for its education, and then that child does well at Fettes, wants to go to St Andrews, you're saying, OK, the taxpayer will pick up the tab for that. Why?
Martin, our policy in relation to free tuition is well understood by the Scottish people, and we don't go back on our promises in relation to this. You may look at the Labour Party, of course, when they were elected in the 90s, gave great promises in relation to free tuition and reneged on them. We've been very clear in our policy position on this over the course of a number of years. Free tuition is a policy we will stand by, and we must be very careful not to conflate what's happening in one institution at the current time, and I accept there are challenges in others, to be in any way an argument to reintroduce tuition fees. You know, the next generation should not have to incur the debt on their backs because of decisions taken prior to their time.
£900 million a year this policy costs you. Imagine what you could do with that money. It's 5 times the amount you pay every year for trying to narrow the attainment gap.
Look, Martin, we're not going to we'll have to agree to disagree in relation to tuition fees because, of course, the SNP has a policy position on that, which is quite...
It's going to 100% you guarantee it'll be in your manifesto next May.
We know.
Free universal tuition fees.
We know. Absolutely. The SNP has always been committed to a policy of free tuition. This is not a change in tack from us, but what we are seeing, I suspect, is a movement from some to use the incident at Dundee University in some way to justify reintroducing tuition fees. That's not a position we can credibly stand by, because we know, as in the case of Dundee University, tuition fees has not been the major factor at play here. So we need to be very careful.
But you could generate yourself a little bit more headroom, couldn't you? I mean, your policy on tax, right, is that those who have a little more can pay a little more.
Absolutely.
So why isn't that the same with education?
Well, look, in our education system, there's lots of additionality that we're providing. You talk to the attainment challenge in our schools, and let's talk about the really good work that's been undertaken by our university sector in widening access. We know that one of the key things that puts young people and older people, when they want to go back to university, off coming to study at university is the extent of debt that they incur. Now, Scottish students incur about £27,000 less in debt than their English counterparts and across the United Kingdom. So we are putting additionality into the system. We fund free tuition on a point of principle, and I'm proud to stand by that.
What about what Alison was suggesting there about a graduate payment? £3,500, £4,000, £5,000, maybe when you can afford it a bit further down the road, goes back into the pot?
Well, Martin, I graduated in 2006. We were the last year to pay the graduate endowment that was introduced by the Labour Liberal executive. It was about £2,000 at that time. So this is not a new proposal. It's something that we had in place previously.
So would you bring it in?
No, the SNP scrapped it.
Why?
We scrapped it because we stand by the policy of free tuition, and this was
But once you get to a
backdoor
certain
tuition
level,
fee.
you're earning 50 grand a year. You can afford to pay over time 5 grand back as a little thank you for your education that you got.
Martin, we're not going to agree on this. As a policy position,
that's clear.
the SNP stand by free tuition. I'm very proud
No,
of
you've
that.
made your position absolutely clear on that. What else should universities then do you think to be a bit more responsible for their own futures, so they don't go to? Should they sell assets? We've seen universities buying up property left, right, and centre. They've been awash with money for quite a while, and now the international student numbers are falling. That's coming back to bite them. Do you think they should be selling assets?
Well, that's in the gift of universities, of course, who we've set out and we've discussed today.
But they're going to have to come up with a plan, and you're involved in the meetings, surely.
Of course they do. And in my experience, our universities are very diverse at looking at a range of different approaches to their funding streams. They're very fleet of foot in that regard, and they're independent of government. So we encourage them to do so. You set out a number of solutions or suggestions. I know our universities, they engage, across the piece in relation to their own assets and their own management, and that is rightly in their gift, not in the gift of government.
Are you worried about the future of some of our big famous universities?
Scotland has some of the best universities in the world, Martin, and we want to protect that sector and we give them that support. I talked to the extra money that's coming to them through the Scottish Government's budget this year. We'll continue to work with them. You talk to the wider challenges in the sector. The funding that we've announced that's going to the SFC, of course, is for the totality of the sector. We recognise the individual challenges at Dundee at the current time, and we're committed to working with the SFC.
But these amounts are so huge that you don't have the budget to save them if they're threatening to go off a cliff. Are you worried that we might see one of them go? Is that a realistic possibility?
I've not been presented with that from the SFC at this time. However, of course, the SFC continue to work with individual institutions in relation to some of the challenges. But let's go back to these challenges, Martin. They're not all in the gift of the Scottish Government. So whether it be Brexit, energy increases, some of the impacts ongoing from the COVID pandemic, changes to immigration rules, which are making it really difficult for families, for example, to come to Scotland to learn. All of these things action could be taken from the UK government on these matters. We've not seen that willingness from the UK government. So I'd very much encourage them to consider the role they might be able to play here in alleviating the pressure, for example, in relation to national insurance contributions, which, as I say, University Scotland estimate will cost the sector £45 million in Scotland.
Talking about UK government policies, we're about to get Kirsty Mcneill on from the UK government. We're going to be talking to her about defence, also inevitably about welfare, because it all comes into the same thing. Are you concerned about the impact that their apparent policy on welfare might have up here?
Deeply concerned. It is apparently their policy, and you'll hear more obviously later this morning, Martin, but it's deeply concerning. The Scottish Government's already spending £3 billion a year mitigating Westminster austerity. So, we don't want some of the spending that the UK Government has been investing in recently to fall on the backs of those who can afford it least.
All right. Jenny Gilruth, Education Secretary, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Right, well, they say every cloud has a silver lining, so could the dark and stormy ones that are gathering over Europe's borders at the moment be about to deliver a boost for Scotland's defence industry? This week, on a visit to Fife, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, said spending more money on arming ourselves would create jobs and prosperity, as well as keeping the UK safe in what is increasingly an uncertain world. But at what cost? The Chancellor has promised not to raise taxes or borrowing, so more cash must, therefore, we assume, mean more cuts. And it seems she has welfare payments firmly in her sights. Well, joining me now from Edinburgh is the Scotland Office Minister, Kirsty Mcneill. Welcome to the Sunday Show. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning.
Let me tackle the defence side of this first. I mean, should we see big spending on military firepower as a boon for our economy here?
Primarily, these defence choices have been made because we are facing a generational moment for the security of our continent. We have to stand full square behind the people of Ukraine as they seek a just and lasting peace. It is also the case that boosts in defence spending will disproportionately benefit us here in Scotland. Already, Scotland is underwritten with about £2 billion of UK government defence spending, supporting 25,000 jobs. That was the case before these recent announcements, so both those figures are set to go up.
Right, but you have to find that money to spend on defence from somewhere, and that has led to unfortunate headlines this week. Bombs, not benefits, an attack on welfare. What's going on with that?
Well, I can't comment on what the welfare proposals that are being brought forward this week will contain. They'll be announced in the fullness of time, but the Prime Minister has been incredibly clear about the principles that will underscore our welfare reforms. If you can't work, you should be supported to have dignity. That is an unwavering commitment from the Labour Party, and I'm pleased to reiterate it today. But if you can work, you should work, and you should be supported to do so. I don't think that's a controversial proposition. I think your viewers would agree that we face a situation where 1 in 8 young people are not in education, employment or training, and that simply can't be right. It's a catastrophic waste of human potential.
But
so if you can work, we'll
that's
support
what
you to
these
work.
payments, that's what these PIP payments are for, isn't it? Helping people who struggle to get work. And you're talking about cutting them.
PIP payments are actually to enable independence and dignity for disabled people.
So why are you cutting them?
The proposals have not been brought forward, Martin, so there's been rife speculation on which I'm not going to comment. But what we are clear about is the principle that if you can work, you should work and you should be supported to do so. We've already redirected 1,000 work coaches to make sure that those who are long-term sick or disabled who want to work can be supported to do so. And there'll be other reforms that are announced this week. But we cannot tolerate a situation where 1 in 8 young people are seeing their potential written off in this way.
But if you're cutting benefits, you're kind of supporting people with a cattle prod, are you not?
We are trying to support people who want to work to get back into work. There's plenty that can be done with the Scottish and UK Government working in partnership to do that. Scotland has higher rates of economic inactivity than elsewhere in the UK, and it's a terrible loss of human potential. More than 1,300 kids, Scottish kids, left education last year without a single qualification to their name. We're simply not prepared to see people's potential written off in that way. We're going to support people to have the dignity of work. It's good for their well-being, it's good for their family finances, and if you can work, you should be supported to do so.
People watching this or listening to this will be confused, I suspect. And I have to confess, I am to a slight extent as well, because we started this conversation by discussing this as a way to save money to spend on defence. And you're looking to save £5 or £6 million billion pounds rather, in benefits. So how are you helping people get back into work by cutting their benefits? Just by giving them no alternative? Is that the theory?
There are two processes happening in parallel. We have to deal with the fact that by 2030, if nothing changes, this country will be spending 70 billion on health-related and incapacity benefits. That's simply not sustainable. I don't think anybody thinks that is the right outcome with the public finances as they are. In parallel, we also have a firm commitment to helping disabled people to work if they want to and they can. And the reforms that we're bringing forward are underpinned by that cast iron commitment that if you can't work, you'll be supported to live with dignity. But as I say, I cannot see how it's controversial to say if you can work, you should work, and the UK Government should be there to support you to do so. Likewise, there's plenty that the Scottish Government could do to support those who are currently economically inactive back into work. But unfortunately, they've cut college places, they've cut employability support, and they've ended in a situation where, as I say, 1,300 of our kids left school without a qualification to their name.
But I mean, it's the case that if you can work, you should work anyway, isn't it? I don't understand what's different here. I mean, people will be watching this thinking, who are you and what have you done with the Labour Party? None of this was in your manifesto. You promised not to raise taxes in your manifesto. You didn't say anything about cutting benefits. Should people who voted Labour in the last election in July not feel a bit cheated here?
The Labour Party has delivered things that were in our manifesto just this week. We passed the Employment Rights Bill.
No, but this wasn't in your manifesto, and it's a really significant thing for a lot of people.
It's, of course, significant that the disabled community should be supported to live with dignity. That's a Labour commitment. It's something that we will stick to. We'll make sure that if you can't work, you'll be supported to live with dignity. But we have to deal with a ballooning benefits bill that, as I say, will be spending 70 billion by 2030 if nothing changes. So something has to change.
I mean, there was one of the big manifesto commitments was the Chancellor's fiscal rules, right? Not to increase borrowing, not to increase debt. Shouldn't you break that commitment instead? Isn't it time to break those fiscal rules to generate a bit more money here, rather than hit once again off the back of the two-child benefit cap, off the back of the WASPy women, off the back of the winter fuel payments, hitting the most vulnerable?
We saw what happened when people played fast and loose with the economy, when Liz trusted her mini budget. We're not prepared to return to that. We stood on a manifesto that said we will have stability in the public finances and stability in the economy.
Well, Germany has just created a new sector, a new area, given themselves more space to borrow for defence, and the markets loved it. You can't come out and say if we did that there'll be another Liz Truss moment, because it's been tried by a big European country and it's worked.
Germany's cost of borrowing has actually gone up as a result. We have a Chancellor who is maintaining economic stability, who is trying to turn around 14 years of economic mismanagement from the Tories, and we're already seeing some green shoots that is coming good. Wages are up, business employment is at the highest rate for 19 years, but we have to proceed with responsibility and make sure that we have stability in our economy, because ultimately it's families that pay the price and businesses that pay the price when we don't have stability. We're simply not prepared to go back to the chaos that we saw under the Tories.
This is playing really badly in Scotland, isn't it? I mean, if you cast your mind back to July, Anas Sarwar was kind of measuring up the curtains in Butte House, and now he's down there in the polls with the Tories. You, as a UK government, really haven't helped your colleagues here, have you, with elections just 14 months away?
Polls come and polls go. The poll that really matters is the one that will happen on election day. And when someone is standing in that polling place with a ballot paper in their hand, they will think to themselves, the
manifesto
the SNP
promises
has
you've
had
broken.
nearly 20 years. And what have we seen? A rising attainment gap, nearly 1 in 6 Scots on a waiting list, chaos in our public finances. What they will choose to think about, I believe, at that time is what is best for me and my family, who's going to get public services back on track, who offers a new direction after nearly 20 years of the SNP in administration. And I believe that things will turn around by the time we get to that election. But we're not focused on that at the moment. We're focused on delivering the promises that we made in our manifesto and delivering for the Scottish people.
If that person that we're discussing here, standing in the voting booth with the ballot paper in their hand, is a person of the left, they used to, theoretically, have 2 parties that they could choose here in Scotland. The SNP is a left-wing party and Labour. Do they only have one now? I mean, in what way is the Labour Party still a party of the left?
The Labour Party is a progressive party. We decisively ended austerity. 5 billion extra going into the Scottish Government's coffers to spend on public services. We've just passed an employment rights bill, a once-in-a-generation upgrade to workers' rights that will help 200,000 of the lowest paid Scots, that will end fire and rehire, that will end exploitative 0 hours contract. This is a government firmly on the side of working people.
You've also cut winter fuel payments for pensioners. You've kept the 2-child benefit cap, which punishes the poorest people with children. Now you're going for benefits cuts. How are you a progressive party? You can't really claim that in any real sense, given that these are some of your headline policies from a very short time so far in government.
If you look at the consequences of the budget that we passed in October, it's a budget that does the most for those with the least. We are operating against a terrible fiscal inheritance. We had a 22 billion black hole that we had to fill.
You're also fighting the threat of reform. Is that what this is all about?
I would love us to be in a situation where our fiscal inheritance was different. That's not the situation we faced. We had 14 years of economic and social mismanagement by the Tories. We had to get a grip of the public finances, and we have fulfilled our manifesto commitments in all sorts of progressive directions, including the New Deal for working people, including setting up GB Energy. I'm very proud to be part of a progressive government that is also responsible with the economy and with the public finances.
All right, Kirsty Mcneill, Scotland Office Minister, thank you very much indeed for being with us here on the Sunday show. And that is where we will leave you this week. I'm going. If you're with us on the radio or on BBC Sounds, Graham Stewart is just coming up. I'll be back on your tellies next Sunday morning. Same time, same place. Join me then if you can. Bye for now.